Okay, so I'm doing an experiment here because we're in a series of generations talking about everyday mission, and specifically we did week 1 this last week. It's focused on the command that God makes, and which Jesus, of course, reinforces, and which Paul says the whole law is summarized by to love your neighbor as yourself. And so this is my friend JP Morris. He pastors a Church of the Apostles in Dawsonville, Georgia. It's an Acts 29 church, and so we have gotten to know each other through that context over the last couple of years. And so what I wanted to do is, JP and I were having lunch today, and I know his heart for being engaged in everyday mission, the way he's trying to lead his church, which is a little bit different makeup than our church. Kind of describe the makeup of your church just briefly.
Probably, I think members is probably about 175 people, and half of that is 50 and over.
Okay.
You know, so some young families, but a lot of older congregation compared to a lot of new church plant.
Yeah.
So when I started, it was probably 75%, 60 and older.
Yeah. So an older congregation than what we have at Generations, and so he's trying to lead this church into a more missional kind of mindset and way of living. And so what I want to do in the experiment here is, without any preparation, any notes, I've not told JP where I'm going with this or anything. I haven't had a big plan for this. I just wanted us to have a free-flowing conversation, largely hearing from him just what he's wrestling with and the idea of what it looks like to love your neighbors, and hoping that maybe there's some insight you can gain from an outside voice, a different perspective, somebody else who might give some different ideas to stoke our thinking as a church. And so let me start with just kind of theoretical something. What do you say to this statement? I think I said something to this effect on Sunday, that the mission of the church is to make disciples and multiply churches. The mission of the Christian is to love your neighbor. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, man, I think they go together. I mean, I think immediately of Jesus saying, you'll know my disciples by the way they love each other.
Okay.
And so obviously discipleship and loving one another and loving your neighbors are going to go hand in hand. We say all the time, disciple is becoming obedient to Jesus in every area of your life. And so as I'm growing as a disciple, then I've got to love my neighbor, love those around me.
Yeah. And
so those would be linked like that. You can't not love your neighbor and say, I'm growing as a disciple of Jesus.
Okay.
Right? It'd be opposite forces going against each other.
Yeah, and I mean, we're gonna probably explore this later in the series that I'm preaching through. But I'm curious, just when you think neighbor, what do you think of when we talk about loving our neighbors?
Well, I think of Good Samaritan. The question, when it's posed to Jesus, who's your neighbor? It's everybody.
Yeah. So just really narrows it down.
It's not just the people you live around, but then there's also the people you're going to spend time and invest in and really love in terms of serving and caring for are going to be the people that God's put right in front of you, which oftentimes is going to be your neighborhood and the people you work with and the people you're around, but it's certainly not limited to them.
Yeah.
It would be all people, but you're going to have a limited sphere of influence where God places you. Right?
Have you found, because I wonder if this is the case, that because the Good Samaritan story blows up our idea of neighbor into including everybody,
right?
Do we sometimes think it excludes our actual immediate neighbors? or maybe it's beyond that, and so we forget about the sort of localization of that? I don't know.
I think our sinfulness will twist it to exclude whoever we want it to exclude.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't really serve those people because they're across the world, and so we'll make an excuse on why that might be. Or my neighbors, that doesn't really work because of this schedule or that schedule. But that's why I think it's just who God brings into your life. Right? There's going to be people that you're going to naturally have relationships with. And so I say this often here, God's placed you right where He's placed you for a reason. You live next door to the people you live next door to, and I live next door to the people I live next door to. And God's at work in that, and He didn't put me in your neighborhood, and you vice versa.
Yeah.
He's uniquely gifted us for where He's put us.
Yeah.
And so loving who God's put right in front of you, it doesn't mean it excludes anybody, but that's who you're naturally going to come into contact with.
Yeah, so because part of what you're touching on, and I think this is maybe one of the struggles I've had at the level of my personal life as well as in leading people into this, is how do you decipher between those people that God is putting in front of you and then the idea of living intentionally or purposefully? Right, because you won't...
Right.
So how do you reconcile those ideas? Because I think you would advocate the purposeful intentionality based on what I know about you.
Well, and it's kind of what we were talking about just before at lunch, like the idea, the people of peace that God brings into your life. The people that are already kind of...
Describe that just in terms of what you mean when you say people of peace.
Right, so when Jesus sends out the 72, He sends them out to make, don't take anything with you, go out. And He says, if you go into these homes and as people invite you in, if they're people of peace, let your peace fall in that place, and you stay with them, you spend time with them, you proclaim the kingdom. And they said, if you go in and they don't welcome you, they're resistant, they're totally against, you kind of go, okay, I'm going to move on to the next place. And it doesn't mean you don't care about those people or you don't look for opportunities, but kind of like where God's opening doors, walk through that and be intentional where He's opened the doors. So it's... when we say intentional, your neighbors, you're not going to hit it off like great. You're going to have relationships with every single one of your neighbors equally, right?
Right.
Doesn't mean you don't care about the other ones. Doesn't mean you're not looking for relationships. But like in my own neighborhood, just naturally developed relationships with several of my neighbors. There's some that I say hello to and I know, but we don't really have much deeper relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give time to the ones where they just naturally feel like God's opened those doors. And so go. It's not. I think we make it a lot harder than it has to be.
Yeah.
Right. God opens the doors. You naturally hit it off with this guy. Then we'll spend time with him.
Yeah.
Like invite him in.
When you talk about like the idea of mission, everyday mission, or loving neighbors and that kind of thing, with either in your preaching or with people in your church, do you find that you said that sometimes we complicate it, we make it harder than it is? Do you find that there are ways that you've maybe packaged that makes it seem, I don't know, more elusive, harder to kind of walk out, or because I do think people struggle with.
Yeah. Well, I may be wrong, but I would say a lot of times people hear you say that and they think, and I'm putting this on them, so maybe that's not fair, but I think a lot of people think you mean unbelieving neighbors. They're not believers.
Okay.
And I need to share the gospel with them.
Okay.
And I need to do this. And,
yeah.
And what we mean is like what you said at the beginning. The mission of the church is to make disciples.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say this all the time. Discipleship is not like a only believer, unbeliever, or believer, believer. It's all of that. Like I think it's a whole process.
Mm-hmm.
Discipling people to faith, and then growing in it as they come to faith.
Yeah, so there's a discipleship that's happening of an unbeliever before they come to faith.
Well, I think so. Well, I mean, if Jesus said, go make disciples of all nations, Great Commission, pretty much all the believers are there.
Right.
They're all there, so the only people that aren't there are unbelievers, so go make disciples. Well, he says baptizing them and then teaching them to obey, and so it's like, but my point in that is, instead of it being like, to go love my neighbor, I need to go find an atheist who's against God, who's against this,
okay, so
and then I'm gonna. That becomes like this scary, hard thing.
So we feel like we've got to identify the toughest scenario, and then we've got to go into that. And
or people will say, "Yeah, I would do that. And that's great, but all my neighbors are already believers." We go, "Well, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not."
I don't know if the video caught that. You rolled your eyes at that.
Well, I think
because you live in the South.
Well, we live in the South. Well, what people mean by that is my neighbor Joe across the street. I've invited him to my church, and he says, "Well, I already go to church. I go here," and so. I go, oh, he's a believer, he's good, so I'm just gonna... He can't be somebody I'm walking with, right?
I'm guilty of that.
Well, my point is, you don't know whether they're a believer or they're an unbeliever. I don't know. That's not for me to decide. I'm not the one that makes that ultimate judgment, but that's God's to know. But even in that, like if my neighbor does go and he's part of another body or another local, whatever, that doesn't mean he's not my neighbor. It doesn't mean I don't want to serve him and love him or spend time with him.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that God may not use me or you in their discipleship, walking with them.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, if the whole goal is to make disciples who are making disciples, if my neighbor is a believer and he goes to the church across town, but he's not really growing, and God puts me right next door to him,
Yeah.
and we help one another to grow, and he becomes more faithful, and then he starts to make disciples, and he never steps foot at Church of the Apostles, that's okay.
Yeah,
That's still, you're making disciples who are making disciples.
Well, you've been faithful to the command, love your neighbor.
Right. It's not a matter. And so when people like put it into categories, well, this person's been ruled out because they already go to a church. It's like, well, how do you define making disciples?
Yeah.
Make disciples, right? Like, and I'm not saying you're trying to steal them into your church and all those kind of things. But one, if they're not being discipled where they are, then you should probably, and you have an opportunity,
Yeah, maybe.
then help.
Yeah, maybe.
But I think all of that, it's way more than just like defining it as like my unbelieving neighbor.
Okay, yeah,
and
so-
bringing them to,
So one of the things I said in my sermon on Sunday when we say love your neighbors is that we're not using code language for evangelize your neighbor or convert your neighbor.
right.
We're just, like God's saying, take tangible steps to do things to demonstrate love for, care for, concern for.
So go back to
your
all
neighbor.
that. How you define what does it mean to love someone? Right?
Yeah,
A lot of times
which we haven't delved right into that yet.
Well, a lot of times we say that it's a feeling of affection, but really showing love to someone is going to be sacrificing of yourself to give to them and care for them and serve them and do all these things. And so loving your neighbor might be, this happened last week. My neighbor went into the hospital very abruptly. Turned out he had huge blood clots and was in the ICU and horrible stuff. Well, that happened because he was in the middle of mowing his yard and he couldn't breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes, well, me and another neighbor went and mowed his yard. It's like,
Yeah, cool.
he literally left in the middle of mowing his yard and it was halfway done. And it's like, he's in the
mower
hospital.
was still there running. So.
And so it's like, well, we should probably do something that, well, and there's nothing, it took 30 minutes. It's not like a huge gesture. It's not a whatever, but it's just, okay, well, here's a way we can go and love your neighbor.
If you really loved your neighbor, you would have healed him of the disease.
Yeah.
But whatever.
He was already in the hospital. I didn't know.
Your wife's a pediatrician. Come on.